Hello, welcome to EMD Media. EMD Media works on understanding, measuring, and doing, and strives to add into the evidence-based discussion, decision-making, and discourse in the Horn of Africa, and particularly in Ethiopia. Your host is Getachew Asefa. Those who are following us live on YouTube and Facebook, please share, like. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. Okay, welcome back again. Today I have the pleasure of hosting George Kidane as my guest to converse on war on Tigray versus Eritrea and Eritrean news perspective. George, welcome to EMD Media Show.
Thank you, Getachew. I'm glad to be on UMD Media and speaking with your viewers on very pertinent issues of the day, especially in the context of what's happening right now in the Horn of Africa. I think it's, especially at a time like this, we really need to start discussing more our ideas and our opinion about what's happening and come to an understanding, even if we don't completely agree or have the perception to give a way to come to a conclusion or some sort of understanding about what's happening. But shows like this, I think, are really important for that conversation to begin.
Very good, yeah. So it's like I said, I'm very happy to have you here. So this would be adding, at the end of the show, I'm confident that this will add into the understanding component. Perhaps maybe also to the measuring aspect of what EMD Media is trying to do. So for those who don't know you, I think it's worth introducing you through some slides, as I usually do in these shows. So if I start from the topic, you are a young man, obviously, and you want to add, and you are capable and well positioned to do that, I believe, in terms of what an Eritrean who strives for justice, democracy in Eritrea, but also, any country, is not isolated. So it interacts with its neighbors and so on. So you are interested in what's happening in Tigray and so on. Those who want to follow you, what you have been doing, how you communicate, interact with the community at large, I believe Twitter is one of the mediums, and you are active there. George Kidane, his handle is @Kidana_. And I can't help but, pay attention to your profile picture where you say, let Eritrean, I think Eritrean kids learn. So maybe, other way of also introducing to the audience what you stand for, which will be a subject matter of today's show. Can you talk about that hashtag, let Eri kids learn?
Sure, I'll start with an introduction of myself and I can go into Let Eri Kids Learn. My name is George. I was born in Asmara and I moved to the United States very young age, like infant child. Both of my parents are from Eritrea, so I consider myself a dual citizen, but also a citizen of the world. And growing up, I've always felt proud of my identity as an Eritrean American, and especially within the context of the first 18 years or so of my life and adolescent period. I always had an inkling of trying to understand what's happening back home, not just in Eritrea, but also in the Horn of Africa region more generally. I think it's very important for Eritreans in particular, but also just more generally people who come from more impoverished backgrounds to take stock in what's happening in their home country. Eritrea has maybe 4 or 5 million people, the population, and that's being generous. So I guess I would say I would encourage everyone to be, if not politically active, at least engaged in understanding what's happening. And what's occurring in the region today is very abnormal and uncommon in the world's experience. So as I said, I'm from Eritrea. I was born there. I moved here very young, and I'm 20. I just turned 21 as of the recording of this video back in late April. I'm interested in neuroscience, biochemistry, medicinal research. That's my career path. That's where I see myself. I'm very interested in experimental medicine and research design. But when I'm not spending time doing that, I, of course, am interested in talking about the Horn of Africa, African politics, and stuff like that. And I wanted to engage with others who are like-minded and have a desire to be motivated from others to learn more about themselves through the lens of the story of the Eritrean experience since independence. Let Eri Kids Learn is a very recent initiative that sprouted from individuals who I am closely connected with. The program was initially designed during the lockdown of the school system in Eritrea. The Ministry of Education prevented students from going to schools due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So essentially, we would be broadcasting lessons from Erisat, if you know that YouTube channel, and they would provide programs for different subjects to school children, mainly in Tigrinya, but also in other languages. And many of those people who were designing this program were involved and saw a need to continue the education during the lockdown due to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has since been lifted at the beginning of April due to the reasons officially from the government saying that they have had essentially control of what they see as the spread of COVID-19 in Eritrea. I have my own opinions about what that actually entails. But even though that the government has reopened schools and there isn't as much of a need to do this anymore, I still feel like it's important. And I would just profess to anyone who's interested in wanting to connect to me, if they would like to reach out to me and they have someone they know back in Eritrea who wants to get some tutoring, specifically in science, natural science subjects, but other elementary topics as well, just let me know. You showed my Twitter handle, so I'm easily available from that avenue. But there are many people who are involved in this. It's not just me. And I think it's an initiative that many people have undertaken in order to curb the government's very militaristic influence, especially in the education system.
Continuing on that, this is what you, I think, with your friend or a couple of friends, Dena Nesanet. So this is a YouTube channel. Actually, one of the things that I saw when we were discussing about you coming to the show was through this, you also reached out to other media outlets, including I don't remember, but an American, a US-based one where you on the phone, you were. We'll talk about that as well because that attracted my attention. Given that I didn't know about that media, but they were asking you again and again about how other Ethiopians kind of felt, at least convinced them that the bad guys are in Tigray and Ethiopia is doing what it should be done and so on. But you can speak about this Zena Nesanet as well, given that it gives our audience a background why George has been advocating for what you have been advocating?
Sure. In December 2020, a colleague of mine, Daniel, and myself, we were discussing privately about the need to contribute our opinion or analysis of what was happening in Tigray. At the time, the government had just claimed that they had retaken Mekelle, and there were reports from the region that essentially the cleaning up operation would be commenced. Essentially, they would take care of what was happening. But we knew that wasn't true. So that was sort of the first aberration out of the region, which influenced Daniel and myself to start talking about this in a way that other people could reach out, comment, and share with us what they thought, and allow us to understand essentially what's really happening. That's why we really started Zena Natsanet, Freedom News. That's the literal translation from Tigrinya. So we started that in January, but in December we had the idea and we were talking about doing it. Our very first video we uploaded was just me talking about the PFDJ, the ruling party in Eritrea, which has been in power since essentially the independence of the country. And since then, we have conducted a various amount of interviews. As you stated, I appeared on what's called Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik, which is a Russian-based radio station, but it's in the United States, among other countries. And I have the specific intention with this platform to just continue interviewing people who have a good, informed understanding of Eritrea, but also the region more generally. I'm interested in, just as you are, trying to get a better sense of where do people come from with respect to the region, and how does that influence their thought process when it comes to the foresight that is needed to really understand why Isaias does what he does, but also other political actors in the region. So that's sort of the shortened summary of why we started Zena Natsanet. And since January, when we started uploading those videos, we also created a website. And mainly Daniel has been contributing many articles on that, and he's been writing. I've written one article. I hope I can find time to do more. I'm in college, so there's a lot of other work that I'm doing. But I invited people to just come on, and I've been doing a lot of advocacy to bring guests on to understand what their experience has led them to believe from all the work that they've done. And since that time, I can confidently say that we've had a pretty good engagement of people who like our videos and like the content of our interviews and our conversations that we have. In early February, I believe, we also started to invite foreign or international guests who would also be able to contribute positively to our channel, in the sense that they would give their analysis on what's happening. So we've had many different guests on, and we continue to have more. We also interviewed a refugee who came from Eritrea, and he explained his experience coming from Wia, which is one of the hottest places in the country. It's in the lowlands near the coast, and it's very hot, is a nice way to say it. So just in short, Zena Natsanet was a very small initiative, a media outlet that my friend and I just created just to get a better sense of what's happening. How can we advocate for those who do not otherwise have a voice or have the ability to speak out? And we really are enjoying the work, and we invite anyone who's interested, who has a good understanding of the region, to come on our platform as well, in addition to yours, and continue speaking about this. And I'll just say one more thing about Zena Natsanet. Maybe we can discuss maybe more in detail. We decided specifically to do most of the videos in English because we wanted the outreach, we wanted the perception of our platform to be one which is welcoming and opening. to all of the viewers who see our videos, because sometimes it can be inhibitory for people like myself who are maybe adolescent years, who don't speak Tigrinya or Amharic very well, and they don't feel comfortable talking about politics. So we wanted to put the platform in a way where it would be very open and frank, and just give viewers who are our age, who are from Eritrea, the ability to just participate.
Very important. And for those who want more, I mean, you're not as active as I could see, and you also told me that. So, but it clearly showed that you can be reachable that way as well. So, as we speak, we are in a new territory, given what happened the last 237 days. So today, the day 237 on war on Tigray. So we have been showing this in every show, the numbers, staggering numbers on the humanitarian cost, the children, the women, the emergency humanitarian aid need, and so on. But we are doing this show live, hearing that TDF forces controlling or entering Mekelle, and Abiy Ahmed, Isaias, who have been, on the record saying no to any peaceful solution to this. We just read a press release from the Prime Minister's office, of course, giving, a pretext of getting the request from the interim administration of Tigray, and we say okay to a peaceful, a cessation of hostilities and so on. So how did you learn about this breaking news, and what do you reflect on, given what you have been following both for Nazanet news, Dena Nazanet, and every activism that you have been doing? You are closely following, I'm sure, the development there from day one. So what is the feeling, and how did you learn about today's news?
Well, I learned about the news of Tigray Defense Forces recapturing Mekelle. Actually, I was at the hospital when I learned about the news. I was doing some work there, so I didn't really have time to reach to my computer and look up in detail what was happening. And I actually have to, after our discussion today, I will be looking more into what's been happening. And I'm sure that during our conversation, there will be more updates as the developments go on. And in the coming weeks, I really think this is going to be the most crucial part of the conflict. Earlier in the month, we've seen TDF forces start to make gains, especially in central Tigray. And I think at this point, we should still be cautious about the news that is coming out, only because the media blackout has still put a hamper on everything that is coming out of the region. The telecommunications blackout has affected severely the way that we're getting the news, and not many reporters are really able to filter that information and verify it. So I'll say at this time, as the news breaks, that I'm thinking of the people who lost their lives. I'm thinking of those who were displaced in Tigray, including Eritrean refugees who were at Hitsats and Shemelba camp and were relocated elsewhere. I'm thinking of all of the destruction and the mayhem that has occurred in the past 8 months, all of which is needless, and it's barbaric. And it's very unfortunate now that after 237 days of war, that Abiy Ahmed and Isaias in particular have made a tactical decision, whether that is the case is irrelevant at this point, to call for a ceasefire. As you rightly said, they were not willing to concede in the region, and they did not feel like they were at a disadvantage by retreating their troops. But I think now, I think we can safely say at this point that many sacrifices had to be taken in order for this news to develop, and I'm sure that in the coming days and the weeks that we'll learn more about particularly what has happened during the period of time in which TDF recaptured the capital. But just as a reflection of what's been happening more generally, I just think that this war was not necessary. And there were times as far back as May of 1998 that these issues could have been resolved. The border war was a pretext for Isaias to continue his military strategy of completely wiping out his opposition in Tigray, including Eritreans who had fled, who had established themselves either in Ethiopia more generally, or who were trying to escape from the national military service. And I think it's a sad tragedy what has happened in Tigray, because no one has really won. Of course, TDF, of course, they recaptured Mekele, and the military personnel and political the groups that are facilitating the region, of course, have taken back what's theirs. But at the cost of what? You know, there have been so many devastating losses that just have gone needlessly and brutally over the past 8 months now. And so many civilians and soldiers have died yet again for another war that didn't have to happen. I mentioned 1998. Those initial arguments between the former leadership in Ethiopia could have resolved the border crisis, the border delineation with Isaias. But since that time, most of the relevant political actors in Ethiopia have died, especially in this war, CM Mesfin, and among others, and Meles Zenawi. And we can, of course, talk about his legacy and a controversial figure in Ethiopia. But Isaias Afwerki is really, I think, the manufacturer of all of this conflict. And he has had a long-standing vision of essentially becoming the major player in the Horn of Africa. And if it takes wiping out an entire ethnic group, we've seen that he's going to do it. If it's forcibly conscripting his own citizenry and forcing them to fight in a war that they really don't know, he's going to do that. Abiy Ahmed, I think, as many people have described him as a dictator and autocrat, I think he's more of a proxy for Isaias's interests. And we can discuss more about the peace deal in particular, because I think that was probably the first sign that this war was brewing, because it was a leader that was not affiliated with Isaias's enemy. So there were a lot of places in which this war could have been prevented. Unfortunately, though, the hubris of the Ethiopian leadership at the time felt like they could proceed without worrying about an invasion from Eritrea. And I think they made a mistake in undermining or underestimating Isaias's sheer vengeance, because we're seeing now that he will stop at nothing to do what he needs to do in order to become essentially the influencer in this region. We've seen him go in other places. In Somalia, he has tried to recruit for President Formaggio. In South Sudan, he's tried to recruit President Salva Kiir. And in Sudan, unsuccessfully, he tried to recruit Prime Minister Hamdok, and that was more of a perilous situation because of the uprising against Omar al-Bashir. So there are many faults that occurred in the time between the peace deal and what's happening right now. And of course, this has to be taken into consideration when discussing the Tigrayan response with respect to the border delineation, because it was not immediately in place after the peace deal was signed in 2018. So I would say, in short, there are so many ways that this conflict could have been avoided. unfortunately, it has commenced, and the losses that have been sustained on all sides, but especially in the Tigrayan perspective, have been catastrophic.
Yeah, we will definitely talk about all that. Let's talk about Eritrea or Isaias. I mean, we will talk about them, separately. So you mentioned him a couple of times at least, the manufacturer of that and so on. So was there anything that this was coming? I mean, we have done a number of shows on EMD Media, for example, on his speech from July 2018, where he was clearly saying after the peace deal, or the so-called peace deal, let me just show it here, where he was, on record saying he is for working for political cleansing of Tigray, political hezbo in Tigray. And he was mentioning about restructuring the economy of Ethiopia, and so on. And his stooges, his cadres were also on record writing openly saying that, even after TPLF is wiped out, no political entity in Tigray should be, left alone, and so on. So how do you read all these? And the young man who is interested now in changing the circumstances in Eritrea and so on. Did you see this coming? I mean, you were talking about Isaias, but he's not alone. I mean, he has a military. He has, I would dare say, an elite that supports his doings and so on. So how do you assess all that?
Well, I think the immediate red flag that should have been a warning for everybody was the Nobel Peace Prize. It should have been a very serious warning for the Ethiopian population and the Eritrean population in the countries. I'm not talking about the diaspora. I'm talking about inside the countries. When the Nobel Peace Prize Committee selected Abiy Ahmed to receive the Nobel Peace Prize and not a joint peace prize. I think this is probably the first warning that should have really gotten people's attention, because usually when peace is restored between two countries, both leaders facilitate the process in which the peace is brought about, whether that is through negotiations from both governments, whether that is a diplomatic solution where the embassies are reopened and there's communication between all of the political actors that are relevant to the situation which brought upon the crisis to begin with. These sort of things did not happen between Eritrea and Ethiopia. It should be noted that when the border crisis began after the border war in 2000, Isaias and Meles Zenawi did not get on well at all, and there was very serious hostilities between both governments in Asmara and Addis Ababa. And since that time, the Eritrean government has taken a very hardline stance against the Ethiopian government, rightfully because the Ethiopian government did not cede the territories which it was occupying on Eritrea, especially in Badme. But I would say that is a result of Meles's perception that he knew at the time that should he give up his power or should he let Isaias take over the border, that he would implement himself in Ethiopia. I think Meles, as much as he was a bad leader in many other respects, he was very wise to not engage militarily with Isaias after the border war in 1998 through 2000. I think that Abiy Ahmed made a very serious mistake by doing a peace deal with Isaias, because there's no way that you could make peace with someone who has been accused multiple times of crimes against humanity, war crimes in other respects, serious persecution, violation of human rights, lowering every citizen to a very meager and frugal working class. In some instances, people are very poor and they're begging, and conscripting young males and females, high school age kids, into the national service indefinitely. These sort of attributes do not describe a good leader. And I think Abiy Ahmed was very naive in trusting someone like Isaias to do a peace deal with. But I think Isaias was very tactical in his approach for two reasons. Firstly, because he was dealing with a political leader who was not affiliated with the TPLF. But also, Abiy is headstrong and he has an ego problem. Of course, many people know that once when he was a child, that his mother told him he would be the seventh king of Ethiopia. In other instances, people told him he's a very smart security personnel agent. So he's been bolstered and he's been essentially given false confidence. And he moved through the process of delineating the border from his side of the border very quickly. And it wasn't a way to deal with the issues that were accumulating in Tigray very effectively. And I think Isaiah saw his inexperience as a way to manipulate the Ethiopian government. You know, we hear a lot that many countries in the West should not interfere in Eritrea's politics or Ethiopia's politics. And I fully accept that. I think it's important that every country has its own respectful and strong apparatus of sovereignty when it comes to handling its own domestic affairs. But it cannot be understated that Isaias Afwerki directly interfered in Ethiopia's affairs through the conduit of Abiy Ahmed. And he was very lucky that he was dealing with someone who, just as long as he could work with a guy who would be able to listen with him, then he would get the result of being his second hand and right hand man, or second in command. It's very challenging to see how the Nobel Peace Prize Committee could have seen this leader collaborate with someone who was taken, his government at least, to the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2016 and was accused of many high crimes. And I think the Nobel Peace Prize Committee was, and the international community as well, they were very naive and made a mistake in trusting Abiy in that regard. And they shouldn't have given him that opportunity to really establish himself as a peacemaker so early on in his tenureship as the prime minister.
Yeah, you have a point there, George. But there is an understanding in some circles of Tigray and, you know, in the West now, that this was not just a random mistake. It was maybe part of a grand plan of, you know, reorienting the politics in the whole, you know, how China was perceived as influencing the region and so on. So I could be wrong, but there is a perception, at least, that the TPLF or Tigray was considered in some elements as the last trench for, you know, Eastern influence and so on. So of course things change a lot, right? We are seeing that Abiy is running away from the US and the West in general and going to China and Russia and so on. So, but going back to Eritrea and Isaias, help us understand the element of atrocities, you know, these crimes that were being committed by Eritrean army soldiers, you know, from the looting to the gang rape to the destruction of infrastructure. I mean, looting, we're talking about, I mean, confirmed reports saying that they have not only been looting food, you know, utensils and so on, but burning what they can't take and so on. So how does, you know, a military, an army, you know, can be going to this extent. What did Isaias do in the psych and in the I don't know operation? Operation of this military genocidal war in Tigray. So, what is your take? What did you understand from what has been going on over there the last 8 months?
Well, in a very short or a brief way, Isaias Afwerki is doing in Tigray now what he has been doing in Eritrea for the past 20 years. He has brutalized the population, subjugated them to mass crimes to the point where they're essentially his personal figures. They're his items, so to speak. The National Military Service, for those of you, your viewers who don't know, is indefinite in Eritrea. There's no way to leave from it legally in the context of the Eritrean government. And Isaias has used the National Military Service as a way to enslave the population. He has been able to brutalize children for years and has brainwashed these children into thinking that the perennial enemy is a certain ethnic group, a certain political group who has their agenda set on destroying Eritrea, when we know that the conflict which has resulted in this conclusion was brought on by the fact that Isaias and Meles had a personal relationship that fell down. I think it was Shettel who, on your program earlier, described a very important aspect of international politics, that when the relationship of two countries is based on the relationship between two leaders, it is very fragile, and it could actually result in very bad future engagements with one another. And that's exactly what we've seen. The border war was essentially a false flag for Isaias to use the military to establish what he felt at the time was his personal garrison, which would be able to defend his regime against the Ethiopian regime at the time, the TPLF-led EPRDF coalition, which was headed by Meles. So it was a battle between two leaders, not a battle between two people. But over time in that border war, as the crimes got more and more severe and very brutal, and Eritreans were victimized in the time where the graves of former fighters were disgraced upon by enemy militias. Isaias used this pathos very effectively to convince the population that the only hindrance to full success in Eritrea was Tigray. And he used this war propaganda for years, saying that Meles would not accept the border commission. My personal theory on this, we really can't know for sure, because many of the political actors who were relevant at the time have since passed away. So we can't really get to know their understanding of the crisis. But if Isaias really cared about the border issue, he would have stepped down and let other people try to resolve it. But he didn't. So we know now that the border war was just an excuse. And I think that was the initiation for his military campaign to really establish himself in power even more so. Some of your viewers may know Warsai Ikalo. That's essentially the program in which the students are recruited into the military service through their 11th to 12th grade transition period, where they're taking the exams, and if they are skilled enough or they're academically at a certain level, they can go on to the technical colleges. If they're not, they're to the military. Well, that was phased out as soon as the GIFA was essentially established to round out students to continue building his army, because he was losing so many children to this incredibly disastrous situation. So he used this as a mechanism to continue his stay in power. And that's how he has been able to sustain himself, especially against the Ethiopian government when it was led by the TPLF at the time. Neither side really conceded, and I think the Ethiopian government in particular messed up by not accepting the border commission, which was established in April 2002. They could have um, put Isaias in a hard spot by accepting it and then telling him, well, look, if you accept, okay, if we accept it, then what's going to happen next? I mean, you're going to have to step down and let other people come in and continue running the country. But he did not concede at all. And I think that should have been a sign for those who at the time were paying attention to this development as a way of seeing that he was not willing to step down from power. Neither of Meles, of course, because he also had to put his interest in the border, and I think it was more about him staving off Isaias rather than to actually claim Badme as an Ethiopian territory. I don't think he really thought that. I think he just did that to put Isaias in a very bad place, and that's how he isolated Eritrea for so many years and became an ally of the United States and other Western countries in that regard, especially in the fight against terrorism and security, especially with UN peacekeeping troops being based throughout the Ethiopian lowlands near the Somali region, Ogaden at the time when Meles invaded Somalia in 2006. But ever since that time, there has been this recombinance or this continuing manufacturing of war and conflict, which has kept both of these regimes in place until, of course, at least for the Ethiopian perspective, the Cairo protest movement, which started in 2014, 2015, which eventually brought that regime down to power. But in Eritrea, there is no such thing because you cannot protest. You don't have the freedom of speech. You do not have the freedom of religion. Many of the basic and fundamental human rights of peoples have been reneged ever since 2001 in particular, but throughout the existence of Eritrea as a sovereign country under Isaias Afwerki's leadership, solely because of his interest to stay in power. And we've seen mass violations of human rights and the violent refusal to acknowledge anyone as being independent or as being an alternative to the leadership of Isaias, because it really, in my perspective, it centers around what his security interest is, which is to displace the TPLF once and for all. Today, it's a very different situation, of course, with the recent developments in Mekelle, as the TDF have reclaimed the capital city. But he has had this very long-standing goal of just repressing and eliminating any of his opposition in Eritrea and outside. And as long as he has to use the military as his way of doing so, that's what we have seen and what we are seeing today. So I would say that Isaias has really brutalized the population of Eritrea, brainwashed many people into thinking that one person is the enemy when he is the enemy of Eritrea. And he has been the one who has lied for so long about very troubling aspects of his failure of foreign policy. If he had let other people run the country or participate in resolution efforts, I don't think we would be here discussing the war in Tigray today. Unfortunately, of course, his leadership has caused so much heartbreak and destruction. And I would just, on behalf of Eritreans, I would just like to say to Tigrayans at this time that we are very sorry for what's happening, and we're not for this war at all. This is purely Isaias's war, and it is the PFDJ and the Higdef regime. This is on their doing, and we in the Eritrean community are doing as much as we can to challenge them in the diaspora population. We're advocating on behalf of the Eritreans who have otherwise no chance to speak on these issues, who know that this is wrong, to say that we are completely against this conflict. There's nothing good that can come out of this. And it's important for Tigrayans to know that we're with you. We're supporting you now. We understand that we have many, many issues in the past, but in this time, we have to be in solidarity with one another and say that this war is wrong. We want to have a peaceful means to resolve all of the conflicts that have been circulating for so many years without any resolution because of the failed leadership in both Eritrea and in Ethiopia and Tigray as well. I would put all three of these political actors responsible for what's happened. And I would say that we're not going to let you down. We're not going to let Isaias get away with this either, because should there be a transition in which Isaias is actually put up for trial due to all of his crimes of genocide, mass rape, treason, crimes against humanity, religious persecution, and all of the above, which has he already done in Eritrea, and now he's doing in Tigray. We want you to know that we are committed to ending this regime. We want change to occur, not through violent means. We want it to occur in a peaceful way. I hope Tigrayans feel the same way. And for those who may not be as familiar with this region, there is an explanation for all of this suffering. It didn't just come out of a vacuum, or it appeared out of nowhere. This has been a very chronic history of tragedy, and it's especially sad that he has exported his very brutalistic tendencies into other countries, and it's very unfortunate.
Mm-hmm. On the understanding of what's happening in Eritrea, or what has been happening, over the last 30 years, there are a number of experts who try, to explain, to document, and so on. So at least I have talked to 3 of them on this show, from Martin Plot to Shetel Trovo and Alex Dahl. I just want to show Alex Dahl's book. We discussed part of that book in this show as well. Here he is talking about the money aspect, the political budget, political money, business of power, and so on. So in this book, he clearly says that Isaias Afwerki, the expert in all this, getting paid for sending Eritrean news, to different countries as, Congo, Yemen, everywhere. And we know Abiy is paying him, among, other, reasons that he is into this war. There is this political budget also in this war. But what it's hard to understand for your, our audience from Tigray, and myself included, is you are saying, from your perspective, what you have been doing, and other Eritreans also doing, and what they feel, and so on. But isn't it true that, for example, Eritreans in the diaspora, the elite diaspora, I mean, in terms of the educated and so on, did they say enough? Do you think, in your view, did they do enough? That's one question. The other one is, as we finish this show, what do you see coming in Eritrea? I mean, you are for peaceful transition, but we are talking about Isaias and his clique. Is peaceful transition at all possible in Eritrea, or is it something a wait and see game?
So for your first question, when you're talking about the elite, is it with respect to money or finances, or
all, in terms of just letting Isaias unleash what he has been doing in Eritrea, and now, taking it, exporting it to Tigray. I mean, in a different maybe scale and level of atrocity.
Sure. So it's important to note that ever since the ruling party officially established itself in the government. But even before that, in the early days of independence, Isaias has put in his cadres in the government, especially in the mid-levels or in the desk offices where the ministers would be located. He met in secret with these people to discredit the leadership that was turning on him begrudgingly so, due to the fact that increased tensions were occurring just before the border conflict in 1998. And in the time which the PFDJ was starting to structure itself in a way which it could not, it could essentially block out or phase out any other voices of dissent. Isaias, first he articulated his disinterest in negotiating with anybody, but then he identified those who were against him. Very early on, in 1994, I believe, he identified Ramadan Noor, who was probably the first notable example of this to occur in the parliament, when Isaias said that he would not compensate war veterans who had fought in the liberation struggle. Then later on, during the border war, many voices of opposition started to say that what we're doing in Ethiopia is useless, and there's no feasibility in fighting a war that does not essentially have an ending, because it's going to lead into a situation of attrition. And that's exactly what happened. Essentially what Eritreans call no war, no peace, or this Cold War state, was a direct result of Isaias not listening to anybody else and just going through his own agenda of seizing military victory in Badme and in other disputed territories, notably Zalambesa, Tsorona area. So that has been his long-term strategy in terms of seeing anybody who opposed him and then just removing them, either by arresting them, exile, excommunicating them, whatever the case may be. The most notable instance of this was in September 2001, when the group of 15, the G15, were arrested in that morning. Many politicians, journalists were detained because they were sowing divisions against at the time, government, which is the regime. So the elites in Eritrea are mainly found outside the country, working those desk offices, as I said, in the embassies. And these people have been fueling the war propaganda, I would say, almost as much as Isaias has, in the sense that they are his political puppets. They are his mouthpieces. They are giving the rhetoric in which the so-called opposition, Wayane, are the only enemy for Eritrea, and after that, everything else is fine. But as time went on and Isaias's military ambitions were degraded, he started to add his rhetoric towards other nations, especially the United States. He advocated for the United States to build a military base in Eritrea, in Assab. And when he lost that, he was very disgruntled. He spoke in 2002 with Donald Rumsfeld, who was part of the Bush administration, and wanted to lobby for, I believe it was a Navy or a Marines base to be stationed near Assab, but he lost that to Djibouti. And later on, China also built its first overseas military base in Djibouti. So he saw the intensity of rivalry between different militaristic regimes start to leverage his own regime power. So to compensate for this, he started to do the GIFA, like I said, do the roundup of the children into Sawa, into other military camps throughout the country. And he started to push the war propaganda even further with respect to the border war, because he said, we lost so many people, we are in a state of perpetual violence if we are not armed. And it's very interesting to see, going back to Abiy, that in 2018, he said that we lost nothing. He said, I Sernan. He said, we didn't lose anything, we are fine now. And it was a very different rhetoric than what he's been saying the past 20 years. So the context changed in that respect. respect. So we know now that the elites who were pushing this, as you were asking, were primarily responsible for answering all the questions that Isaias was getting after he said that, because Isaias doesn't have to face any opposition in Eritrea. If anyone speaks up against him, they're going to be arrested or killed. But in the embassies, those who are supporting the PFDJ, they are particularly having to construct different narratives to justify being on a war footing for so many years. And it's really interesting to see now, especially in the context of the current crisis. The Eritrean government initially denied that the military was in Tigray. Of course, we know that was false news. But then when it very conveniently just let the Ethiopian government say that the Eritrean troops were just guarding the border and saying that the TPLF launched rockets at Asmara. Well, we also know that on November 9th, Humera was shelled by Eritrean troops. So the TPLF firing rockets at Asmara was not the reason why Eritrean troops went into Tigray. The reason why Eritrean troops were in Tigray was because they already had to supplement the Northern Command attack, which was established first by the ENDF. Whether or not the TPLF actually attacked first, I think, is up for an investigation, because we need to verify that it happened the way that the Ethiopian government said it did. I'm not saying that they're lying about it. I can believe that the TPLF attacked the Northern Command, but was that retaliatory, or was that in self-defense, or was that a preemptive strike? What exactly happened on that day? And I think that we can, if you like, we can also speak about that. Going to the other question about financing the regime for so long and speaking out, and the lack of Eritrean voices speaking out of the regime. There are many people who have done this. There are people who have tried to speak out, but they've been threatened, usually by being doxxed online. And for those of your viewers who don't know, doxing is essentially releasing personal information on the internet. Death threats, arrests, other attacks. In some instances, people were being thrown. People were throwing acid at regime people who are against the regime. They got acid thrown in their face. So many attacks, physical, also personal attacks, were occurring. So it's not like it's just easy to speak out against the regime. And it's very, I would say, brave of those who are doing so inside the country to continue to speak out. There is the opposition movement, especially in 2012 through 15, 16, called Arbiharnet, Freedom Friday, who were operating as essentially an underground cell network that was releasing information essentially as whistleblowers to inform contacts outside the country to get them on the same page, essentially, about what's happening in Tigray. Actually, in January 2013, they broke a story about a mutiny that took place in which the military took over the broadcast, and the television station was for a short time being occupied by the military, but of course that failed, unfortunately. So ever since that time, it's really hard for the regime to be penetrated inside the country. But we've seen many protests outside, and I would say again, for those who may not be familiar with Eritrea, or those who are suffering because of the regime, I understand that there is a lot to be done, but also understand the context which we're coming from. This regime acts like an espionage state. They know exactly where people are if they sense that they're being attacked. They have ways of intimidating people, and it's not easy for people to speak up when they know that this is happening to them. So I would just implore for Tigrayans to seek reason when it comes to the fact that the regime is very antagonistic against its own people, even more so than Tigray. I would just say that, because even though Isaias has had this long-standing vision of being the major political force in the Horn of Africa, his biggest threat has always come from inside. He's always said that Tigray has been his biggest threat and that the Wayane are launching a campaign against him. But he knows that democratization is not an affordable process for him to stay in power. In other words, if he gave other people the opportunity to lead the country, he would not be able to do so because his ideas are so unpopular and brutal that they would never be accepted in any circumstance. So we have to understand that this regime is operating under very narrow and short-term interest, which is very dangerous for a country to be in. It's also important to know that the financing of the regime has come mainly through paying diaspora taxes, an expatriation tax of about 2%, which has been paid to the regime for many years, ever since they implemented the policy in the country. In fact, Eritrea and the United States are the only countries in the world that do this practice. It's outlawed in other countries, and in some instances, you can actually be arrested for this. So what they're doing is essentially extortion, which is illegal. Other ways that they finance the regime, that those who want to, at least, others who are they are put in a position where they have to because of their families, is through remittances, and they send through wire. They wire the money. I don't know exactly the term of it, but they send the families their earnings, and they can sustain their families that way. Mainly, the interest of the regime is to extort, or to extract rather, resources through its mining sites throughout the country. In particular, a very disturbing example of this is in Danakalia, which is where mainly ethnic Afars live. And there's a potash mining quarry that some experts have estimated that there's an up to 200-year lifespan of this quarry to extract natural resources. And Isaias has, I would say, he's ethnically cleansed the Afars in Dankalia in order to mine these resources so that he can get money from corporations so that he can continue to pay off debts that he may have. And it has resulted in many Afars being discriminated against. It's also led to mass displacement of people throughout the country because it's a disproportionate population density of the country. Many people live in the mountain highlands area, and those who live near the border areas of Sudan or Djibouti or in the Afar region of Ethiopia are targeted either through the mineral sector or because the regime has the interest of keeping the population small such that it can establish its own proxy environments where they can continue to manufacture wars. The first of this was between Eritrea and Djibouti. They actually had an island, I don't exactly remember the name of it, but they fought over that disputed territory in 2008. And again, with other countries, Isaias has continued to propagate this sort of war footing for so long in order to keep himself in power.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing that is, right now a subject matter of interest for many who are observing or also affected directly by this is the fate of the leadership in Asmara. With Isaias at its helm. So there are those who argue that TDF wants Tigray Defense Forces wants secure Tigray. They should directly or indirectly work for toppling Isaias. And they are comparing this with what you were mentioning before. So when Mellas was in power and the TPLF after Mellas, as you know, was the very strong supporter of Eritrean sovereignty in terms of independence. The Eritrean people fought for that, right? Nobody handed them that independence. But like you said, Eritrean opposition forces in Mekelle, in Eritrea, they were not given the right support from Tigray, from Ethiopia, when they wanted to, fight against Isaias, for example, right? But there are people who are saying now is the time. not only for the sake of Tigray, which is very important, because even if they leave now, Isaias will not work on developing Eritrea or securing Eritrea in terms of democracy and so on. He will again come back on this. So, but you are saying for a peaceful transition. That was my question earlier, and we want to finish with this one. Is that even possible? Or, is it something you just wait and see? So let me just show our viewers. This is, Martin Plotz's book on understanding Eritrea inside Africa's most repressive state. And he wrote an article as well on Eritrea, a mafia state. It's a question mark. There, when we discuss about these two books, works from him, I asked him the question of understanding Isaias, and he was clear. He knows him, I think, for the last 40 plus years, maybe 50. And he was clear about he is a man who has no, principle or guidance in terms of consistency. If any, what he's consistent about is he will dump, any ally anytime, domestic or otherwise, to secure his power, to continue in power, and so on. So, as a young man, maybe you can also help our audience understand what motivated you, or because you are not there at the young. You came as an infant, right, to the States. So you are not
as an infant, yes.
Yeah. So you are not one of the people who went to Sawa, or had to flee through Sudan or through Tigray and so on. So with that understanding, how do the future play out? How do you see the future play out in terms of the regime in Asmara?
Sure, I'll go through a couple of things. First, I hope that, and I will reiterate that the transition between the dictatorship in Eritrea and a more peaceful and democratic nation happens peacefully. At this point, it's very hard to tell whether the TDF has the intention of taking revenge on the Eritrean Defense Forces in Eritrea. I don't know if that's really a possibility, that they would go inside the country and overthrow the government. I could be wrong, of course, but that would really surprise me. I think if they're playing their cards right, they just stay in Tigray, and their priority should be to protect the civilian population and to make sure that no one else can continue afflicting harm to Eritrean refugees in Adi Harush and Mayani, because those two camps are still partially blocked off from the international community, and they need to facilitate a way to ensure that the refugee population, which has accumulated in the past couple of months, can be safeguarded. So I think the priority for the TDF at this point, with respect to the ceasefire that has been called by Ethiopia, should be establishing peace within Tigray and then facilitating a negotiation within Ethiopia first. As for the question of how will the regime end, I've had the longstanding view that I don't think the regime is going to be toppled militarily. I just don't see that really being an instance that could really promote real change, because if one regime topples another, then you still have a militaristic society which oppresses the rights of people. Is it possible for an actual stepping down to occur? That, again, is up for time to decide. We really just don't know. And it goes back to one of the aspects of war, which is really unfortunate, especially in this war, which is that the media blackout has really confused people. Speculations have circulated online for so long now that it's really hard to understand what is it exactly that's happening and how is it happening. I think we also need to understand that if the regime were to change militarily, then that would also put the civilian population of Eritrea at risk for execution or other crimes. So facilitating change is going to be very crucial at this point, because should Abiy actually concede and start negotiations with Tigray, then he's going to box out Isaias, and he's going to leave him hanging dry. And Isaias is not going to like that, and he may get rid of Abiy. So whether this is actually going to happen or not is up for time to decide. And we really need to just be patient. I know that's very hard to hear, but that's the unfortunate truth. Because for so long now, we've been kept in the dark about everything that's been happening, and we've been misled for so long that we should allow time to guide us through a process which is completely transparent. And if that does take a considerable amount of pressure from the international community in order to facilitate change peacefully, where the government in Ethiopia and Eritrea are forced to sit down and they have to make deals, or otherwise they will face targeted sanctions, which could be a possibility, then that needs to be in place. The other point that you brought up with respect to, is Eritrea a mafia state? It's certainly a mafia state in the sense that it has very tight security and espionage on the people. As I said in the beginning of our discussion, Eritrea only has maybe 4 or 5 million people, and that's really a generous estimate. So everybody knows everybody, and even within ethnic enclaves, everyone knows everyone. So it's really hard to escape from what the regime may do, because they have essentially controlled the entire country through the only organized institution, which is the military. Eritrea has been deinstitutionalized slowly over time, and it's really hard for the government in Asmara to really suddenly prop itself up again through the military if there's no other backing force which it could rely upon, because should the military fall, then where's the government going to turn to? So all sides, I would implore them to just stop fighting and to just sit down, because there's no winner in this war. I know that Tigrayans, they may disagree. They may say, yeah, we won. I mean, yeah, in that respect, but no one has won. Everybody has lost so much, and the conscripts from the Eritrean military who have been brutalized and brainwashed and told to fight are losing their innocence very quickly, and they need to psychologically heal, as well as the Tigrayan population, and even those who supported this war really need to be checked for some mental illness or something, because there's no way you could support something like this happening for so long. So I would say there needs to be a lot of clarity and healing that needs to take place before such an event like transition is to occur. I'm not saying that there is a time limit on it, of course. I know that many Eritreans want to see change immediately. I do as well. But we also have to be careful, because if it goes wrong, the situation could be even worse, and violence could exacerbate the already fragile situation in the country. I would just say at this moment in time that there needs to be a way where every party involved in the conflict is involved in the peace negotiation, because we already saw one mistake prior in 2018 when the so-called peace deal was signed, which, by the way, we still don't know what's in it. And it was not signed officially in either country. It was really officiated in Saudi Arabia, of all places. So we need a pact that ensures the protection of everybody, and all relevant actors which are involved are able to fully commit to something where peace can be long sustaining. If either party doesn't want to commit to that, then the people need to really express their concern that the war will continue. And I would say, for Eritrean perspective, that as many chances as the regime has gotten, if they cannot do something as simple as just put down their arms, they just need to go. And the international community cannot turn a blind eye on Isaias anymore. They have let him go for too long, and the coverage of this conflict has not adequately covered the Eritrean responsibility enough, in my opinion. I understand that this is an Ethiopian war, but at the same time, Abiy Ahmed is, in my view, a puppet of Isaias's security interests. So there should also be an emphasis on whether Isaias is sent to the International Criminal Court for his acts of genocide, or at least the attempt of wiping out the Tigrayan ethnicity from Ethiopia, as well as crimes against humanity and war crimes which were committed. And ultimately, and I'll just speak on this maybe if you're not going to discuss it with others, but genocide in this context is going to be hard to prove from the Ethiopian perspective, I think. I think they can prove it if competent lawyers are able to do so, if they can show that that peace deal had the specific intention of displacing Tigrayans. If they do so, I think it'll be a good way to prove that the Ethiopian government was premeditating their intent on wiping out the Tigrayan people. But for the Eritrean case, it's going to be much easier to prove that they are committing, at the very least, ethnic cleansing. Because Isaias has, time and time again, said that his intention was to destroy Tigray. So I would just say that the international community really needs to take seriously this conflict and this issue, and not feel pressure from other institutions to back off somehow, because what we're seeing today in Tigray is our generation's Rwanda. And it's especially abhorrent that there hasn't been enough emphasis on ending the conflict in a way which is amicable. Instead, it had to be ended through a ceasefire or a cessation of hostilities from the Ethiopian government, when they said that they would not give up. Now we're seeing that's happened. So it's an all-around tragic situation and a very ugly conflict that never should have happened. And I think in the long term, we need to be very careful of anything that happens after this, because that peace deal, I think, should have been the first red flag for that Nobel Prize, I should say, should have been the first red flag when the Nobel Peace Prize Committee didn't recognize Isaias as a true broker of peace between nations. They should have realized that he had much more sinister intentions when creating such a violent and disgusting war.
Interesting. Yeah. So with that in mind, you have spoken to the people of Tigray on behalf of Eritrean youth and so on. So if you were to speak to Eritrean youth of your age, your group in the diaspora, and of course it's not easy to speak to those in Eritrea, but if you were to have that chance, what would be your plea, your message to them? With that, we'll end today's show, George.
Well, first, I'll speak to the Eritreans in the refugee camps in Tigray, because they have been affected by this war directly. And I will say to them, we're thinking of you, and there has been an effort to really represent you in government throughout the world. Last week, or actually 2 weeks ago now, I had the pleasure of attending an APPG conference with Lord Alton from the United Kingdom. And he has been placing a huge emphasis on the protection of Eritrean refugees in collaboration with the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Eritrea, Dr. Mohammed Babakar. And the Eritrean refugees should know that we are always thinking of you, and we are placing a very heavy interest on your safety. And we want them to be safely moved to a third country. And so far, I think Sudan is handling this crisis to to the best of its ability, of course, understanding the crisis that Sudan is in with its fragility towards democracy. To the Eritrean diaspora, I would say you have to speak out. We need to speak out, because this regime will not stop doing what it's doing. It has no intentions of stopping, even if it's on its last knees. If it's on its last life, I should say. If it's on its knees, it will not stop. This regime is genocidal. It's brutalistic. It has all the intentions of wiping out every Eritrean that opposes them in order to establish their own interests. The Eritrean diaspora should be galvanized and united to stand against Isaias and his regime. You need to ask yourself, why is it that we keep silent about these issues? These are not questions that should come as a surprise 20 years later. We are in a perpetual state of war for so long, and it's very troubling to see that Isaias is exporting his repression into other countries while accusing other nations outside of the region of doing the same thing, when it has not, or at least it hasn't to the same degree as the dictatorship in Eritrea has. So I would say, put more emphasis on protesting against the regime and the government and those who support them, because they are also responsible for this crisis getting out of hand. And then finally, to the Eritreans in Eritrea, I just want to say, we're always thinking of you, and we always want you to know that you're not silent or alone, because again, this regime is going to fall one day. We know that for sure, and when that happens, we should be working together to establish a commonplace in which we can all facilitate a transition towards full democracy.
Great. Thank you so much for your time, George Kidane. I was pleased to have you as my guest, and I'm confident our conversation today has added some elements to the understanding of the war on Tigray, the Eritrean role, and maybe the future of the region or part of the region in the Horn of Africa. I hope we'll also speak on similar issues, hopefully not on bad circumstances, but thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Getachew.
Have a good one. Dear viewers, you have been following my conversation with George Kidane, War on Tigray versus Eritrea, Eritrean News Perspective. And as the story develops in Mekelle and in Tigray in general, EMD Media will be hosting a number of shows this week and the coming days. A couple of announcements here. On Thursday, I'll be speaking to Yosef Gabrehewot, an Eritrean prolific writer, I must say, who has been writing about the Eritrean region, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and the Horn of Africa in general for so many years. So I'll be speaking to him live on EMD Media on Covadis, Ethiopia, Eritrea, War on Tigray at the Lens. Our program will be in Amharic on Thursday. Before that, given the recent development in Mekelle, I will be speaking to Professor Shettle Trombo on War on Tigray, latest developments and ramifications. So I'll be speaking to Shettle on Wednesday. Stay tuned with EMD Media. Thank you for viewing and for being with us today. Your host was Getachew Safa. Bye for now.